Hi, everyone. I'm going to have a deck prepared, but I really just want to summarize the presentation by saying I wanted to create a macro view of what's going on in health AI right now. I use the word AI struggle. I struggle to use the word because it really is a marketing term right now. We're talking about large language models and what they're doing for healthcare. AI really isn't here yet. So I'll use the two hopefully together, but interchangeably as we go. So what I did is I just put together the landscape, a little bit of history there, trying to do some forecasting as well as to what's going on in the segment. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and okay. Good chunk of the time will be in PowerPoint, but not the whole time. Okay, what's this? Okay, hopefully everybody can see what's going on. Awesome, I'm getting nods. And please just ask questions as we go along. The whole point of this is just to really be interactive and try to learn from each other. So, I already covered that. This was the quote. If I had to just have one slide, this would be it. It comes from the manager of an Optum Real product, which has just been released. It is essentially a tool that Optum offers its providers to look at the contracts and the payment terms that they have using large language models and LLM. I'm absolutely amazed that Punet, the person who quoted the part in red in italics, was allowed to say what he said. Because for years it's been rule-based system against rule-based system in an adversarial supply chain between providers and payers, each trying to one-up the other to gain a foothold on payment, essentially. The whole addition of digital medical records, digital claims, has only made this process worse. And it sort of snowballed. So now Punet is taking the next step and saying, what was rule-based against rule-based is now going to be your AI against my AI, meaning providers against payers. Healthcare is a little unique in terms of this type of supply chain. I came from aerospace, where the types of things that go on just don't exist. There are chains of exchange of value in aerospace and automobile where you have a validation step and a delivery step before payment is made. Things are much more calm in terms of the contracting stage and things like that. Only in healthcare that I know of, and maybe professional sports, do you get this idea of such adversarial relationships between people in a supply chain. So that's what a lot of this presentation is about. I don't want to ignore the clinical side, which is, of course, very important. But given where all the investments are, it's in what we're talking about, this adversarial relationship. Basically, payment optimization is the cleaned up term that we use to apply to that. So one of the things I want to harp on is really, and what's driving the industry, is a lack of information. And in case you were wondering, what's powering all the economic growth, arguably all the economic growth in this country for the last 2 years, it's all boils down to a large language model. So what I'd like to do is just give a real quick once over. If you're a data scientist, my apologies, I'll be really fast. But what all this is about, and as I sit in meetings and I listen to decisions that are getting made around LLMs, there's a fundamental lack of knowledge that drives a lot of the decisions. Where it all came from is a technology called Word2Vec, which has been around for a long time. And what Word2Vec means is I'm taking words and I'm converting them to numeric representations. Once I've done that, the computer can more easily understand what words are and what the relationships are between words. And they do this by measuring the distance. So the blue arrow in the sentence, this is a famous sentence in the Word2Vec, is king is to man as woman is to queen. And what's happening is relationships are being measured between the word king, the word man, the word woman, and the word queen. When you take all these and you put them into a large language model that measures each word or word part as a token, you'll hear that term. That's how we pay for LLM usage today, and tokens used, or now they've moved to gigawatts, but it's really the same thing. You can very accurately record the relationships between words in a sentence. So the BERT model, which was one of the first large language models in 2018, used 768 dimensions to track each word part. Once you've done that, you can then do the math at the bottom. So king minus man plus woman equals queen. This was a huge step in technology. It allowed us to do a bunch of stuff. So this is before 2017, when the first transformer that made large language models possible was released. We had Word2Vec. We could do studies on what was the general direction of a text. Was it positive? Was it negative? The author of the Dead Sea Scrolls was actually discovered using a Word2Vec process that matched the style of writing of that Dead Sea Scroll with other known publications of the time. So you're seeing a very useful thing that helped us understand words in ways we never could before. So this is 2017, 2018. Along comes Bert. And when I say Bert, I mean the Muppet character Bert. And that's who the Google team named it after. What it stands for is bidirectional encoder representation from transformer. And the important part of that is bidirectional. It can read up and down a sentence, forward and backward, which is something that couldn't have been done before. So the difference between a large language model and the Word2Vec is here. I don't like using slow reveals in slides. I just like zooming in. If we look at this sentence, the dog ran, and the vector representations over to the right, in BERT, those representations would be 768 characters long. The addition of the large language model, the modern large language model, is this whole idea of an attention layer. And it's here in this yellow box, but I've also included this graphic of attention. And attention's job in the large language model is to keep track of relationships between words and concepts. So imagine a giant spreadsheet that maps the relationship between the word children and every other word that you're studying and garden. So in this text, the words children and garden are meaningful to each other, as are the words children and playing. So once you've mastered this, now you understand how a large language model can, when you enter into a prompt, where is most healthcare spending going? Okay, it's running it through this process. It's making the mathematical comparisons between the words, and it's giving you an answer back in the model output side, because these relationships were the closest. That's how it forms the sentence back to you. And we now can apply that not just to words, but to images. So instead of words, it's pixels, and also audio. So instead of pixels, it's frequencies. And these are the ways that modern LLMs work. It's not magic. And if more people understood this, I think we'd be in a lot better off than we are today. So, and as with most bubbles, and I think we are in a bubble, lack of understanding is one of the key drivers there. So, last slide on background. I found this wonderful study about technology intervention over time and what it meant to GDP per capita. So, what's your output as an individual to an economy, and how has that changed over time? So, there are certain things that don't change each time technology is introduced. So we get increased productivity. If you look at the chart from year 1 till 2000, for a lot of human history, it was just you and maybe a SCI or some tool managing acres, a very limited amount of acres you could manage or plant, given you didn't have any mechanized tools to help you do that, to amplify your human abilities. So things were flat until the first industrial revolution. So we're getting increased productivity. Jobs are being displaced because people are moving. Again, using the industrial revolution as an example, they're moving from agricultural jobs to industrial jobs. There's obviously a skill shift going on. For example, there aren't a lot of people that can make a wagon wheel anymore or a buggy whip. Those jobs have gone away, and they've been replaced by other things that actually pay more. So that's the trend. If you look at in greater detail, I hope you can see this because I'm seeing people's images. I'm zoomed in on the chart. At each technological intervention, there's a bend in the chart. So first industrial revolution, you've got water power. The chart bends. You get more efficient in per capita output. Along comes steam power. You get another bend. The green revolution, there's a lot of different green revolutions. There's one in India that didn't work out too well. So what I like to reference is the green revolution that had to deal with better hybrid crops after World War II, using greater degrees of mechanization to grow things, and the ability to automate vast functions across the economy, from automated machining that took off between 1900 and 1950, where you could set up a machine and walk away and it would just make parts for you without any human intervention, to the use of chemicals to grow higher density crops. That's what's going on in this giant bend here around 1950. The reason why I included this chart is the digital revolution, really, of the 80s, where you saw PCs start hitting desks, people spending most of the day in front of a PC. There's no bend in the curve. And I think there are reasons for this, in that we've misused digital technology. And my favorite example of this we'll give you the deck after. So Steve Jobs called the computer a bicycle for the mind. And he did so after reading this article in Scientific American, which charts the energy efficiency of transportation across different species. Down here in the lower right, a person on a bicycle is by far more efficient than any other animal. Take the bicycle away from us and we're terrible. I don't even know where we'd show up. Mice are definitely not doing well. But somebody took the time to measure all this. And Steve Jobs said, the computer can amplify our thoughts. It can make us better thinkers, get more done, do better work. And I don't know that we've really achieved that. If you walk around most offices today, there's people cutting and pasting from one system to another that doesn't agree with the other one. They're not connected. I've got reams and reams of logins that I have to manage. And once you're through all that, you really haven't moved the bar too much. When I think back, I'm old enough to remember when I started work, you didn't have a computer on your desk. You shared a computer with somebody else, or there was a central computer. The bottom line is we didn't bend this curve with digital. And think about the money that was put into it. So with the advent of artificial general intelligence, and we don't even have a definition for what that is, we're hoping to bend that curve again, or at least that's what we're being sold. So with all that said, and I'm getting a little philosophical, we're going to move into where we are today and try to do an analysis of where health AI is today. So here we are today, and enter Charlie Munger, who is Warren Buffett's lesser known but extremely intelligent partner at Berkshire Hathaway. The way Charlie addressed concepts and thought about things was backwards. And he used to say, invert, always invert. So the whole idea is rather the human nature is to think of the positive things that come out of new technology, especially. So we think about LLMs, we think about freeing people from redundant work. We think about drug discovery and all the positive things that can happen from an LLM. Well, Charlie Munger would say, nope, you got to think about the bad stuff that's going to happen first, because that's what undoes technology. That's what undoes movements. And he did so in a multidisciplinary way. He liked to study psychology. He thought the way psychology was taught was just dumb. And he basically reinvented the entire discipline. If you read, I have the link in the bottom, Poor Charlie's Almanac, he goes step by step in how psychology is just very poorly taught and doesn't really address human tendency very well. To give you an example of how Charlie approached things, he was in World War II, he worked as a meteorologist. And he actually taught a class titled How to Kill a Bomber Pilot. And the whole idea was if you thought of all the ways to die in the air and you avoided them, then you'd have a reasonable chance of success rather than thinking of all the ways to succeed. And his famous quote was, tell me where I'm going to die and I'll make sure and never go there. So the whole idea is let's look at what's going on today through the lens of inversion. And to get us going, I love talking about Dutch tulip mania of the 1630s. This really happened. It's studied. Many of you probably know it pretty well. So let's just go over what happened. So someone in the Dutch, just to set the stage, they were the world power in 1637. This is prior to British ascendancy. Okay. Somebody found this flower in the Middle East, which we now know as a tulip, and they brought it back, and it became all the rage. People had a strong desire to own and sell tulips, which sounds crazy, but it really happened, and we know them now for the tulips that still grow there. But what happened is, as tulips became more and more popular, people started speculating on tulip growth. In fact, there was a derivatives market where people were buying tulips that hadn't even sprouted yet. They weren't even bulbs. So you end up with this magnification problem across, there's more money in speculation than could ever have been sold in tulips. There was this concept, and I'm picking these out because they're common to what's going on today with LLMs. There was a perceived scarcity. There was a virus that infected tulips in the beginning of the bubble, and it made people think that they were more scarce than they actually were. And this myth was perpetuated by people who sold tulips. One of the other big problems is the Dutch were so rich, they made giant mistakes in terms of their risk taking. So when you look back, again, using Charlie Munger, what could have gone wrong? What could have gone wrong is most of your economy is invested in a plant you can't eat and has no intrinsic value whatsoever, other than just being pretty. So what ended up happening in the tulip mania is people gave up planting food. They planted tulips, and winter came over several years, and people starved to death because they couldn't eat the tulips. They became so obsessed over them that all they had was tulips. And it caused tremendous economic problems. It eventually righted itself. But the comparison between tulips and present-day AI is a little scary. So over here on the right, we've got the first application, the first similarity between tulips and LLMs are doubling down on losses. Nobody really is making money on LLMs right now, yet we have huge swaths of the economy dedicated to investing into this technology. And it's so bad, I actually made a slide on it. And there are certain characteristics of the way data centers and LLMs are being funded that are especially troubling. So there's this whole idea of vendor financing, where let's just take NVIDIA and XAI. They fund each other, which is, again, circular. But here's the catch. They're not funding each other with equity. Say someone invests in their stock, they take that value out, they reinvest it in the business. They're funding it on debt. And it's coming out of JP Morgan and PIMCO. And that debt is not really directly tied to that company as debt is. It's more tied to us. It's our mortgages, our savings. That's what's funding this. And if it doesn't work, it's going to be just like the subprime mortgage crisis. It lands on us, not on the shareholders. And then even worse, the company that's putting together a lot of these deals is called Magnetar Financial, who was instrumental in the collapse of the subprime mortgage crisis. So that one alone, it's not difficult to imagine a headline of the future that says, AI bubble pops, consumers left holding the bag, Magnetar walks away with giant fees from structuring all these deals unscathed, and nobody goes to jail, which would be similar to what happened in the subprime world. So that's its own slide. I have it. All my stuff is footnoted. So when you get the deck, if you're so interested, you can look, follow that. Okay, back to the similarities with tulips. Perceived scarcity is a big part of LLMs. NVIDIA is very smart when they make their chips. It's not just the chip that does the processing, it's tied to the software, which creates scarcity. The software only works on NVIDIA chips. That's not to say that only NVIDIA can do large language model processing. However, they are by far the dominant player. So they have very smartly locked themselves in. There are companies that can compete with them, and one of them is Google itself and their TPU, not a GPU, but they have fractions of the market. And so there's scarcity that's being imposed on us that's driving up the cost of these chips. An MIT study that studied the power usage of LLMs uncovered some really troubling statistics. One, there's more deals that are already inked and paid for than we generate electricity in the United States today. So if there was this massive adoption, there'd be a hard stop against our ability to generate power. One of the anecdotes they use in the study is that if you do an image creation prompt, you say, draw me a picture of Toy Story, let's say, for example, that energy created in that query is equivalent to charging a scooter, an electric scooter. So when you think about what would happen if this became widely adopted, industry pounding against large language model databases all day to do processes in healthcare, let's say, doing revenue cycle management, things like that, the power requirements as of today, I don't think would work, which again speaks back to you have this tulip that doesn't really do anything except look pretty. And here we've developed a technology that couldn't possibly help everyone because there's just not enough bandwidth in the energy grid. NVIDIA stock, next up, it's gone up 1,200%. I think since I even wrote this, it's even more, which is, to quote Charlie Munger again, it's just not stable. By virtue of its rise, it is inherently unstable, and no company has really just continued that pace without at least taking a break. To get a little further out on the limb on the inversion, so thinking about what can go wrong. So we studied and we learned through the Cambridge Analytica scandal that social media can change the way people vote. And more than that, it certainly can change consumer behavior. So what if brainwashing I'm just using that as my term, but what if brainwashing actually became the big problem and not AI? This is in creating divisive relationships between people over politics or social choices that people make, or just steering people towards doing things that cause problems, like voting just for one particular political party that can afford to do more manipulation of people. What if AGI were used to do more bad than good? So we've already touched on this way back in 2016 with Cambridge Analytica, and I'm sure that we've gotten a lot better at it. This manipulation of people in the news that you see than we were then. MIT study came out this fall. 95% of all AI projects fail. And the reasons for this were they overshot. They just overshot on the capabilities. And they tended to do more things like marketing automation rather than simple, let's just get rid of the cuts and pastes in the system to magnify people's work effort. They overshot in almost every case. And again, this is tied to a lack of information about what LLMs can really do. Next and last one I found in terms of relationships between what's happened in the past and what's going on right now is, what if AI widened inequality? So you have this concern that people, quote, with easy jobs that do redundant things, like say I'm filling boxes at Amazon, or I'm an analyst or software developer, and I don't write very difficult code. I'm just basically changing code that's already been written. My job might go away. Well, what would happen if those jobs go away, but people in the top 2%, the decision makers who are managing money, directing large organizations, they're fairly safe from this trend or what we think is going to happen with LLMs. What if that really widened inequality? And there are discussions going on about guaranteed minimum income, which I think from an economic standpoint is, if you gave everybody a certain amount of money as a standard distribution, wouldn't that just create a new floor for poverty? because everyone would have that much money. You essentially just keep rising the poverty level. But that's just a guess there. But those are some of the things we're thinking about. And I know a lot of them are negative, but I do have some positive ones coming. So with all that, here we are in present day. So if you look over on the right, it's a pie chart, the 2025 health investments. So we got $3.4 billion. 70% of it is revenue cycle. So again, looking at this adversarial relationship between payers and providers, the top pie chart is providers. The bottom one, the best I could find, is a survey from Bain about where payers are spending money. But it's going to be in a very similar place. So what you end up with is only 38% of the yellow slice is in drug discovery and research. And that, is the value add for me. That's where we're going to get better. We're going to help save lives, develop new treatments, things like that. Over on the right, that 70% is really an arms race that doesn't generate any value. It's just payers fighting against providers with a zero-sum game. So over on the right, the other things that contribute to what's going on is the entire industry is based on defensive charting, revenue optimization, which is just another word for, the adversarial relationship. And 50% of physician notes are just cut and pasted. And we know this because you can use a large language model to study the hereditary nature of a physician note in an organization. You can chart where it started, who modified it, and its lineage throughout the organization. The reason why I mention this is that training an LLM is so important. Using quality data when you train the LLM is of utmost importance. That's what developers struggle with the most. But if you're starting off with data that's been manipulated, copied, and otherwise mangled, you're going to have a lot of problems downstream making the LLM work properly. The other one is regulatory capture. You'll notice that there aren't a lot of new insurance companies being founded every day. You'll notice there aren't a lot of new health provider networks being founded every day. They're merging together, they're getting bigger, but there's not a lot of new entrants into the system. And this is because things like HIPAA, things like electronic health records that don't talk to each other, and ERISA and CMS defining what the very nature of care is, literally, at the physician level, they create regulatory capture in the industry, which works against innovation. It works against being able to launch large language model tools in the environment. So that's going on. We have this expectation in the West that there's a one-to-one relationship between the provider and the patient. I walk into an exam room, I expect the doctor to come in or the nurse to come in and talk to me one-on-one. This is not universally attributable to the West, but there are places in Asia and Russia, actually, where they've applied manufacturing design assembly line technology to things like cataract replacement, where it's not a one-to-one relationship. It hurts the scaling law of the adoption of LLM, because if there is this expectation that you're going to have a one-on-one relationship with your provider, then that's a hard stop against automating that position or enhancing that position. So that might need to change. I put robotics in parens there, because maybe the robots could help when they become operational and they're doing like basic stuff like getting your blood pressure or, taking your temperature, stuff like that. A little scary, but I foresee that as a real stumbling block. Back in August, I think it was, Jerry, I did a session where I highlighted an Indian startup that uses LLM technology to diagnose patients based on the vibrations in their hospital bed. And it was amazingly accurate at predicting things like heart disease based on how you interact with the bed that you're laying in. So what if AI just finds more disease that you didn't even know you had, which would, again, drive up costs, in a way that we don't want. I included this chart, which is also known as the chart of the century. It has problems because of the way it's scaled. It also has problems in terms of the way it cherry-picked verticals to go after. But if you look at health is the steepest increase of all the sectors that they chose. And it also has the most governmental control over it. The theory being that the more governmental control that is exercised onto a vertical will drive up the price of the unit price of that vertical. So if you look at televisions down below and automobiles, they're declining. Their quality is going up, cost is going down. They're typically not regulated as much. So I found this to be a pretty interesting slide. It definitely needs to be taken with a grain of salt, but it shows a great divergence between what's tightly managed by the government. So if you look at health plans, their pricing is controlled by the government. The messaging they can send to their members is controlled by the government. You have to ask for approval to even send a message to your own members. You have to ask for approval to raise or lower the premium. So that's pretty good governmental control that you have. And this is the result. On the positive side, I did promise you some positive things. So you got a $4.9 trillion market. 40% of that market is all tied up in admin costs. So there's definitely a rich feeding ground for AI to come in or LLMs to come in and start to automate all this admin that the regulatory capture, the governmental controls put on people, put on the industry. AlphaFold is a shining example of, and it's a Nobel Prize winning tool that Google developed. It helps predict how proteins attach to each other, which will probably revolutionize the way drugs are made. It's done in a way that is so unique to the way LLMs function and so novel in terms of scientific discovery, it's actually really hard to describe. I can attempt if anybody wants to, but AlphaFold is just a wonderful example of using LLMs in a novel way to create tremendous value, which I think is going to help the yellow slice here, because that is where we want to see the growth in solutions versus the adversarial relationship. So I can get back to that if people want. Last slide is, we all know about the Trough of Disillusionment. Every industry, every new technology has really been through it. E-commerce, VR, or virtual reality, take your pick. They've all been through it. I'm not saying that we're going to have a horrible trough of disillusionment, but if it were to happen, this is what it might look like. So Charlie Munger, again, coined the term Lollapalooza effect. The Lollapalooza effect is a convergence of multiple disciplines. So it could be psychology, economics, social behavior, all coming together to cause tremendous good or tremendous failure. Right now, the Lollapalooza effect is that we have these massive budgets racing to implement AI in corporate and healthcare. So everybody's happy. The money's flowing. It's all happening out of people's debt. We're spending, pretty liberally. I randomly put this now flag. So maybe now is, relative to, the trough, a year away, something like that. But then we get to the cold, hard realization that we're laying people off like crazy, and LLMs really suck at math. They still suck at math. No matter how much effort we put in, it doesn't get math right, and it doesn't get a lot of other stuff right. This could lead to entry into the trough. We have our alligator waiting, which I developed in Gemini and cost the electrical costs of charging a scooter to draw this alligator. The trough can be very helpful, and here are ways that we might get out of it. I gotta move here. So the MIT study that it's cited in the deck, reset expectations. Don't think that LLMs are magical. Think about how it magnifies human effort, augments human effort, not replacing human effort. Rethinking the attention layer, and to put this in terms I think anyone could understand, think about it. We've indexed, and Elon Musk has said, we've run out of human knowledge to index. We just ran out. So all the medical research that's ever been published has already been indexed by Gemini, Grok, etc. But we still haven't really solved any diseases using your typical chat interface of an LLM. If you ask the LLM, how do I cure cancer? It can't tell you because it's not coordinating the information that it has already indexed in an ideal manner. Because you got to think that all the sum of human knowledge, there are things that we've overlooked and things that could be helpful. So rethinking the attention device to make it more effective, to reach across different publications, different concepts, I think would be necessary to get us out of and move the LLM technology forward. Efficiency. So we talked about, this one little query is the same as charging a small scooter. That needs to get better. There's compression technology out there that really is helping, but I think rethinking the way the GPU works would also be very handy because they're extremely energy hungry, and we already know that, but the efficiency needs to get better. The answer to exhausting all of human knowledge is to create new knowledge that's synthetic. And this is a huge opportunity in LLMs. And it's hard to describe, but imagine, so you've run out of human knowledge, make problems that don't exist yet in a synthetic way, and train the LLM how to solve them. This creates sort of a halo effect around those solved problems that you can make essentially very cheaply in a synthetic way, and then have the LLM learn on things that it normally wouldn't encounter in human data. So that is being worked on very aggressively right now. The pioneers of this were the DeepSeek, a team in China, and they were the ones who really pushed the boundaries of synthetic data. Back on this side, live training. So one of the downfalls that was identified in the MIT study is that organizations would implement an LLM, people would use it, but as they corrected it, the corrections were never logged. So it didn't retrain itself. The reason why is it's very expensive to retrain an LLM. So that problem would need to be gotten over to say that as the org uses the LLM and they say, oh, this math isn't right, here's the correction, and they validate that the LLM would then retrain itself to not make that mistake twice. That's kind of like a basic one, but there is a definite cost to doing that. The other one speaks to the curve that we saw earlier in the presentation, where we haven't bent the curve with the digital revolution. So think of your operating system on your computer and then think of how we interact with LLMs today. You have this entry for your chat and you're typing in a question. Well, that's pretty dumb. That's not the way it should really work. Instead, think of the LLM as integrated into your operating system of your computer. So what's the first thing you're going to do when you go to work tomorrow morning? It's going to be, I'm going to go through my email. I'm going to interact with people, probably in a very predictable way that I have in the past. And I'm just going to do these same things for the first 45 minutes of work that are essentially wasted time. So what if you had an LLM behind your operating system that said, this is the fourth time you've sent this report to this person with only minor changes. Why not just do it and then ask for the person's approval that owns the computer before you let it fly? And this could be applied to all kinds of things that you do every day to magnify your work effort. Last point, then we're done, is good things come to those who wait. So if you take Apple, and the reason why the Apple logo is there, is they weren't first in MP3s. They weren't even close. They let a lot of other people fail in the MP3 market before they came out with the iPod. You'll notice that Apple, and probably others, really are not embracing the AI revolution. They're still using their Siri, which is terrible by today's standards. But imagine if the MP3 example were played out. We enter into a trough of disillusionment with LLMs. They become, just like they were with Bitcoin mining, they became very cheap when Bitcoin crashed. If that were to happen again, LLMs would become very, very inexpensive to do your compute. And the companies that waited and learned from all of these mistakes could do very, very well. And I'm not saying it's really Apple, especially for the healthcare industry, but it could be Epic, it could be GE, or a whole host of companies that showed some discipline and didn't jump in, and then learn from others' mistakes. So I think I've shown you all the slides. The other thing to look for in the slides is these are the health investments I charted. I just sort of did this manually. I split them into the different categories. I tried to cite where I could, where the numbers came from and the sources. And then I just compared it to how we spend. This is just a CMS document and breaking down how we spend by category in the U.S. I think it's 2023 data is their latest. So that's the presentation. Love any questions if you have any.
Cheers, Tim. Thanks so much. There was certainly a lot to get through, and I certainly learned a good number of things, and it's a virtual round of applause. I know we're very short on time, so I think it'll be good to certainly share this with everybody and certainly have you back to have a more interactive discussion perhaps around what you presented. with the group. If, of course, you've got time, maybe next month. I think that would be great to put together. But in the closing stages, if anyone has any comments or questions, I know, Mark, you put some things into the chat. But if anyone has any burning questions for Tim, I think we've got a few minutes just to quickly chat about it now before we wrap up the session.
I got one burning question. I'm
Sure. Yeah.
Just the current state of patient data that is fragmented, scattered in varying non-interoperable formats. How is it that you're wrangling this? Or is there a standard, practice of wrangling this and harmonizing and at least getting this into a form that can accurately be fed into an LLM with outputs of a higher confidence interval?
Well, we're not. I mean, if you look at claims data.
I tell everybody, AI in healthcare will advance on the strength of its outputs, but those outputs are dependent singularly on the quality of its training data.
Absolutely, and that's why it's the top bullet. The saving grace is device output and IoT. Those are the only things you can really trust. Everything else has been manipulated. So it's like the old game of telephone. There's what the patient really had. Then there's an adaptation. Let's say the doctor, the provider couldn't get paid given that diagnosis and that patient by the rules that are imposed upon them. And this happens all the time. So, in order to get, there's an off-label use for depression medication. So in order to get that script filled, you got to diagnose them with depression. Even if they don't have it, they still get diagnosed and paid for. Right. So right there, you have an error that will persist in the system and cannot be undone.
Well, and you've got wearable data that is not treated as clinical data because it's captured in a non-clinical setting. And so, again, they want to treat that data differently than that which a doctor, did, whether it was, on the up and up or not.
Right. And that's where it comes down to regulatory capture, because ERISA and CMS dictate what is care and what is essentially data gathered from a, quote, medical device, unquote. Mm-hmm. So it's going to take some wiggling in terms of the definitions of things. I think it's going to take a big change in how we fund healthcare. Now, this is my favorite one. What is the dumbest way to fund healthcare?
Insurance.
With insurance, because insurance was originally developed for a Baptist church in Texas in the 1920s when people saw a doctor 2 or 3 times in their lifetime. And now we're actually telling people, you better go see your doctor for this physical, for this colonoscopy, for a mammography. Then we say, oh, you're filing a claim. Did you really see your doctor? That way, there's no trust in the system, and it just is ill-suited to the frequency of the transaction. So that needs to change, and I think, there's certainly a mood to change, because people are kind of fed up with denials and things like that.
But they don't quite know what to do, and there's no, straight path that, magically appears. So it's going to get ugly.
No, I mean, we type on computer keyboards every day that are designed by a psychologist to slow us down. And the reason why is that the keys used to get mixed up with each other in the typewriter. But we still, it's like you have this artificial restraint. And I look at, the financing methodologies in healthcare as an artificial restraint.
I have one quick question.
Go ahead.
How much of your resources, you commented, so much goes to RCM, and you just talked about all the problems, and Mark brought up some great points where we're dealing with the semantic language just for billing. How much, if we separate it to real clinical versus administrative noise, how much of your work actually goes to clinical precision medicine, precision data?
Well, I work for a payer, so it would be zero. So, all we use the term clinical in the payer world to describe case management. Okay, and you could call case management clinical. It can be very helpful, because we're where the data stops, right? We're the only entity in the healthcare chain of command, chain of data exchange, that can see most of what a patient experiences. We try to leverage that in case management, but there's right now, I'm not aware of, although there are many companies that do it, any major payer that has adopted an LLM into its care management approach. So to answer your question, it's 100%, admin, not clinical.
All right, thank you. And we're way past time, and Jerry's usually very strict.
Ooh.
No, not at all, Chuck. Thanks so much for the final question. But Tim, thanks so much for coming on, everybody on the session. It's always a pleasure to have everybody share their insights, as well as yourself, of course, Tim. And I think, with so much content here and definitely more to certainly dissect, I think, it would be remiss of us not to share this with everybody, and then have everybody maybe come and, have more of a conversation, perhaps maybe next month with you, if you have the time to do so.
Okay.